The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
I'm inviting someone into something, a new experience maybe, give them something to think about, enjoy, whatever, and then find a nice way to just exit and leave them with whatever they want to take from it. Because that's one of the things you definitely learn as a writer, that people will take what you write and do all kinds of things with it. You completely lose control of the work once the reader has it. And that's as it should be. The reader, in a sense, completes the work.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. My first encounter with the writing of Kathleen Norris was her book, Acedia and Me. It came along just when I needed it, and her work has meant a lot to me ever since. Her best-known books include The Cloister Walk, Dakota, A Spiritual Geography, and Amazing Grace, A Vocabulary of Faith. Kathleen Norris is a Benedictine oblate. The Benedictines' commitment to good order and deep hospitality is evident in her work. Kathleen's new book she co-authored with Gareth Higgins. It's called A Whole Life in 12 Movies, a cinematic journey to a deeper spirituality. Kathleen Norris, I am just so overjoyed and honored to have you on the Habit Podcast. Your work has meant a lot to me for a long time. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
So your new book, we're recording this on the day after release date, is A Whole Life in 12 Movies. And you wrote this with Gareth Higgins.
Yes. We're both film nerds, basically, just letting our film nerd flag fly there, just kind of and finding an outlet really to share our love of movies with other people.
Yeah. You describe, or one of you, I'm not sure who wrote the little blurb, describes cinema as our most dreamlike art form. And you encourage readers to learn to dream with it and reflect on those dreams. And as we do that, we may well experience richer, deeper, and more creative, connected, and even courageous lives. Big claims for film.
Well, I think films do that. I think most people can think of a film that they saw maybe in childhood or maybe as young adults that really helped to form them, that really gave them a new view of the world. I think for me, partly it was The Wizard of Oz, and Gareth writes about Gandhi and as one of those, and the Goonies. Funnily enough, the Goonies, because he felt the longing for a community that he didn't yet have, and he said the treasure these kids were seeking wasn't the real treasure. The treasure was community, and so I think films have that power and over us, and it was just good to sort of write about movies, some of which were familiar, some of which probably won't be, but they're accessible, mostly accessible by streaming and everything, to just movies for every stage of life, from birth to childhood, to the decisions we make about vocation, who we want to be. There are so many wonderful films about those subjects. And one of the things we did that I think is helpful to the reader, each one of us picked a movie. We each picked 6 movies and wrote about it. The other person would write a response. So sometimes there's a real conversation going on. We don't always agree with each other about the quality of the film. So it's a conversation. And that part was fun, but I think it'll be fun for the reader as well. Maybe to inspire them to have conversations of their own about certain films. And it was just, and then we look at choices we make about how to resolve conflicts, and then death and the afterlife, and views of the afterlife. And so it was just a really fun project to work on.
Yeah. You mentioned that you met Gareth at a conference of some kind and just sort of hit it off. And have y'all been friends for a long time? Is this something was this friendship formed long ago, or is it
2017, and he and a screenwriter named Scott Teems were presenting films at this conference, and a class on films. And I said, I introduced myself basically as a film nerd, and I said, can I sit in? If my schedule allows it, can I sit in? And they were, oh yeah, sure, absolutely. And then Gareth and I started talking about movies, and it was one of those rare experiences that we realized this conversation could go on forever. And in fact, it has. It's just going to be continuing for the rest of our lives, that I had found a friend for the rest of my life. And those, and films is what brought us together. And, now we do the weekly newsletter, and we do now this book. And I wouldn't be surprised if we do another book someday, but probably based on movies and films and how they have inspired us, influenced our lives.
Yeah. Did you say that this week is the 150th episode of your weekly newsletter?
Yeah, a little soul telegram, Movies and Meaning. It's on Substack now. And that for me has been such a joy, because the whole thing, because in 2017, I'd had a number of fairly successful books in the 90s and 2000s. Right. And then I was having trouble with 2 new manuscripts. I was having trouble placing them. I felt kind of stuck as a writer. I was actually beginning to think, well, maybe I've aged out. Maybe the gift has left me. Those kinds of thoughts. I wasn't super depressed, but I was worried about that. And then this opportunity came along with Gareth to say, hey, let's do a little newsletter together once a week. Once a week, one of us will write an essay. It's about 1,000 words. We try to keep them fairly short. The other person will just write about like 3 things I'm thinking about. It can be anything, a book, the weather. I sometimes, because I'm in Hawaii now most of the time, I write about things from Hawaii. And that completely opened up my life again as a writer. And really? I found myself in the newsletter. Gareth tends to write about films that are in theaters, new films, because he has better access to that than I do. And I have just had so much fun delving into film history, discovering women like Lois Weber, who, like historians say, she has been forgotten with a vengeance. But in the early teens, 1916 or so, she was more famous and was earning more money than any male director in Hollywood, including W. Griffiths. In 1916, she did a film about rich women using abortion as birth control. I mean, it's amazing what you find. It's a silent film, a very powerful film called Where Are My Children? And I've been stumbling around I found some films that the actor Ida Lupino directed in the 1950s. One is about sexual assault. Just incredible stuff. And I've also been looking hard into international cinema, finding what I consider one of the wonders of the world, the contemporary Iranian cinema, with all these directors who keep getting shut down by their government, put into prison, sent into exile, and they're still making movies. And they're brilliant movies that show us ordinary people living their ordinary lives in Iran, suppressed by a terrible government.
Whenever I've seen an Iranian movie, I haven't seen many, but I've loved every Iranian movie I've ever seen.
They're really good. They have a good bunch of actors and crew, but these people put their lives at risk now, sometimes making these films, but they still make them. And there was one film by Mohammad Rusalev, who's brilliant, where he's the only name listed as a crew member because it was too dangerous to list anyone else.
Is that right?
I mean, and his film now, he's the one who's in exile, and his film, Something of the Sacred Fig, just played at the New York Film Festival. It played at Cannes, Germany. Thank God. He's in asylum in Germany now. Granted asylum in Germany. Germany chose his film for their Oscar nomination for the national film, which means it will be more accessible to more people. But there's about 3 or 4 different directors, some of whom are still in Iran, and I just admire them so much. And I guess, on the news media, all we hear about is the government and the terrible things they're doing. I mean, they're basically trying to create an empire in the Middle East by taking charge of Yemen and Lebanon and Syria. And all we hear about is bad news. But when you see the films, you see ordinary people going about their lives, trying to ignore the government as much as they can, but they're marrying, they're divorcing, they're having children, they're raising children, they're doing the normal things. And it reminds you that there are ordinary people there that we need to care about. The government is terrible, oppressive, but the films make you care about ordinary people and their ordinary lives.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the gifts of cinema, that it opens you up to go beyond what you see in the news media to find something that's more valuable and more meaningful.
Yeah, I remember reading in a little memoir-ish thing that Catherine Patterson wrote about knowing, she knew, I guess maybe she knew, it was Japanese. She had grown up in China, but later she moved to Japan. And somebody said, how can you move to Japan after the horrible things that the Japanese did to the Chinese? And she said she had a couple of Japanese friends. She knew a couple of people in Japan, and it's hard to think of Japan as an evil empire when you know people there.
Well, the people. That's the thing. And when I've been in Syria and I've been in Turkey and Lebanon quite a few years ago now, before the terrible war in Syria, but a number of people said that we'd encounter them. They would say, well, we don't like everything your government does, but we like the American people, the people met, and that kind of thing. And that's another reason why travel, I think, is important. That travel, it encourages you to think more broadly about what you're looking at.
Yeah. Okay, can we return to The Wizard of Oz? You mentioned that movie was important to you as a child, and I loved the way you talked about it. Could you tell me, say here for our listeners, why that movie had such an impact? Well,
it's partly Western South Dakota isn't Kansas, but it's a little hillier. But I spent my summers with my grandparents and everything in Western South Dakota, and so I knew when that you see that door that goes down to the cellar, the 2 doors that open, I was familiar with those things. In fact, I was told, I don't remember this because I was too little, that when I was about 2 or 3, my family and my grandparents and the people on the farm, we all went down there and waited out a tornado. Now I don't remember it, but that's the kind of thing. And so I was familiar with that landscape and small town tensions, say, between like the woman who becomes in the film eventually becomes a wicked witch, but the woman who wants to take the dog, those kinds of things. I was aware of some of that from my grandmother's gossip, that small town tensions and all these things. But I guess what happened when I saw the film was, there's a whole other world up there in the sky that I had never imagined could be there, with wizards and good witches and bad witches and cowardly lions and all of these things that just delighted me beyond belief. And it was also the first film that I saw in color. that it shifted from the black and white scenes. And that was astonishing to me, to actually see color movies. And as I've gotten older, I've really begun to appreciate more the psychological wisdom of the film, the character of the Cowardly Lion, the character of the Tin Woodsman and the Scarecrow, and the fact that it's quite amazing that when she recovers, she's at home after she's back home in Kansas recovering, that really the faces are the faces of people she's known all her life.
Yeah. Yeah.
The farmhands. And those kinds of insights came to me later. But I just think it's such a delightful film, and it's a wise film. And you know that if you take a child who's never seen it before, they are going to go bananas. They're going to love it. They're going to and they're going to be very scared with that hourglass going and everything. And of course, what Dorothy finally does, she's trying to save her friends, but she ends up saving the whole world. I mean, it's really the story.
Yeah, I've never seen that movie on the big screen, but I guess, was it every Thanksgiving that it showed? It was once a year, some holiday that they showed it every.
Around Easter, I can't remember now.
Yeah, I remember you remembering that being the first time you saw a color movie. I'm wondering if you have ever had, if you remember a similar experience. I remember the first time it occurred to me that a movie was an artifact that somebody made and somebody wrote.
Oh.
They just felt, when I was little, they felt like something that just sort of appeared. It never occurred to me that somebody wrote these things and somebody had to, and it's a little embarrassing. I was 17 or 18 before it really, of course I knew that they didn't auto-generate, but I'd never really thought about the fact that, somebody had to write until I went to see, Raising Arizona. That was the movie that I saw that and thought somebody had to write that. Something about the way it felt, something about the language felt a little Shakespearean or something, which seemed strange to say about Raising Arizona, but it just really dawned on me. It was the first time I pictured the people on the other side of that process who were sitting in a room alone, probably writing.
Well, and I actually now I know some people in the film industry now. A couple of years ago, I went to a retreat that included some directors and everything. And one of them, Isaac Chung, who directed that beautiful family story, Minari.
Oh, what a great movie.
He's a lovely guy. Well, I saw him again at a second retreat last April. And he said, my movie Twisters is premiering. Why don't you come? So I went to my first movie premiere.
Is that right?
Hollywood thing. I'd never been to anything like it. And Isaac is just Isaac. He's not fazed by anything. He's happy that the movie worked as well as it did. But I had, at the after party, after the premiere, I had a wonderful time talking with editors, cinematographers, screenwriters, people like you described. They work behind the scenes, and they're used to people not understanding what they do.
Yeah.
How important they are. And producers also, because some producers don't provide the money, but other producers are pretty hands-on. There was a woman working with Trista who was pretty hands-on in the editing room with the editor and Isaac, and the stories they were telling are just wonderful. But I think they're kind of used to that. They understand that it's a team, and that the movie stars and the directors are going to get the bulk of the attention. And that's okay with them. They seem to be okay with that. Although there was one screening, I joked about being part of a Hollywood entourage. There was Isaac and a very good friend of his, one of his producers, Doug, and like 2 or 3 more other people. I said, "Oh my God, we're going around in these SUVs that the studio has hired, taking us around." And so there were screenings that week for various groups. There was online sites that promote films, but the one that was really interesting was one for members of the Motion Picture Academy. These people had seen Twisters for the first time because it had just opened like a day before.
Yeah.
And then Isaac, and in this case, the editor, Terry Shropshire, wonderful woman, they showed up to do a Q&A, and that was fascinating. Some of that was actually a little too technical for me when Terry was talking about some of her work, but of course, to the people in that room, it was all familiar. but that was just gave me some real insight into how many people it takes to make a film. And as you look at the credits,
Yeah.
the credits go on and on and on, especially for the like the people who work in the digital effects. That
I was about to say, I bet that those credits were a lot longer for Twisters than they were for Minari.
Oh, well, yeah. And that was surprising. That was a completely independent film. There was no studio involved. And that's how all his earlier films, his first film was shot in Rwanda. I mean, the guy's amazing. And but he's always, struggling to raise the money to make a little movie. And this was a very close personal family story. It's really his autobiography, Minari. And the budget for that was $2 million. For Twisters, it's I think Isaac thinks of it as a miracle. Twisters had Warner Brothers, Universal, and Steven Spielberg's production company, Amblin Entertainment, and a budget of something like $160 million.
Well, when I heard the same person directed Minari and Twisters, I thought I had heard wrong.
I know everybody, and Isaac was aware of that. He said, "I'm the Minari guy who's making Twisters. I really have to bring this in on time, in the budget, and make a good movie." I mean, he was quite aware of that. People were kind of skeptical about that, but in those discussions with the groups, those Q&As, what he said was that he felt that he'd kind of reached a dead end, scrambling to raise money for independent films. And he was very glad when he got an invitation to work on some of the Star Wars. He did an episode of The Mandalorian, directed an episode of that. And he also directed an episode of The Wrecking Crew, which is a new Star Wars thing with Jude Law that hasn't been released yet. But he said the people there who had invited him to come and direct really gave him a course on using CGI, which he'd really never used before, and some of those high-tech things. He said it was a real education, and he was thrilled by it. He loved it. He loved doing it. But one interesting thing about Twisters is there isn't a whole lot of CGI in it. He insisted on there is some with the storms, and a few special effects, but that was filmed. It wasn't filmed on a green screen. It was filmed on the landscape near where he grew up. He grew up in Arkansas near the Oklahoma border, and he lost the money. He had to compromise on the budget and some things to insist on filming in that landscape, because that's the only thing that made sense to him. But he filmed on film, and he didn't use a whole lot of CGI. Although he did say that the George Lucas's studio, I forget what it's called, he said what they can do with wind and water, he said, just was amazing to him.
Really? So it's real wind and real water. Yeah,
it certainly looks that way, and so he was very grateful for all of that. But yeah, that was a crazy week. I didn't get to bed till midnight any night that week. Which is highly unusual for me. My age, it took me a few days to recover, not just the jet lag, but to catch up on my sleep when I got back. But it was very, very interesting. Yeah. And just your comment about the people behind the scenes triggered that memory, because that was part of the highlight for me. It wasn't riding around in big SUVs. It was meeting these people who hard workers who care about what they do, and they're good at what they do, but they're content to stay behind the scenes.
Yeah. Well, I envy people who make movies and who make music, and that their work is so collaborative, is so necessarily collaborative, and you don't even have the option of sitting alone in a room and doing it the way writers do.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, in fact, when I went to this first filmmakers retreat 2 years ago, I really astonished them, because I said at my presentation, I said, one thing that I'm really finding interesting, because we had a couple of pretty well-known actors there. They were mostly directors and screenwriters and stuff, again, behind the scenes people. I said, I'm amazed, because I'm finding a lot less ego here than I would if I were at a writer's conference.
Interesting.
Found a bunch of writers, and they were kind of stunned by that. But in our conversation, we realized that that's what it is, because film, you can't do a film on your own.
Yeah.
Filmmaking is deeply collaborative, and I know Isaac in particular, I think other good directors really want to do this. They want to create a community among the cast and crew, and make it, even though the work conditions might be very hard, and I think they were for Twister, but people are getting along, they're getting to know each other, they're enjoying working together. And that's, like you say, writers write alone, and you think, who in the world is going to want to read this? And eventually you have a little community if you get an editor and a publisher who accept it, and a bookstores that, bookstore readings or things like that. There's a kind of community, but no, it's a much more solitary art form.
Yeah. All right, let's bring this back to the book.
Okay.
That you just released. So it's got, besides an introduction and a conclusion, it's got 12 chapters. Each chapter is devoted to a movie, and each
we
chapter.
We cheated a little bit. We say 12 movies, but we actually discussed. We couldn't resist.
That's true. There are 2 chapters that have two movies, and so Gareth wrote one essay for each chapter, and you wrote one essay for each chapter. I'd love to talk about 2 of those chapters because these are 2 movies that I love very much. One is Patterson.
Oh, good.
And the other is Babette's Feast, which I just love so much. Babette's Feast is one of those films that I like the film more than I like the story it was based on. I love both.
I agree. I think that happened. And Babette's Feast was always fun for me to watch with my husband because he was he was an excellent cook, and he knew all the recipes she was using.
Oh, really?
He'd made some of them. He hadn't made all of them, but he'd made some of them, and he knew it. So that was kind of fun for me to revisit that film. And I really like Gareth's. Well, we both emphasize the whole thing about generosity and hospitality.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. Well, I was going to start with Patterson. Let's start with Babette's Feast, since we're already there. So a movie about a mysterious French woman who comes to a little religious community in, is it Jutland? How do you say that part of
Jutland? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's
looks like Jutland, but yeah,
pretty rough country in Denmark.
In Denmark, yes. And so it's a religious community, a little sect that it was headed up by 2 daughters of the leader who had died, and they were feel a little closed off, a little isolated. And this is sort of where you and Gareth begin to disagree, I guess, about the nature of that community. And of course, when Babette wins the lottery, they think they're going to lose her, but instead she spends all her lottery money on making them a fabulous meal because she was a French chef.
Well, and again, someone so different coming into a closed community like that. What really struck me is how well they accepted her.
Yes.
They were hospitable to her. And then I think the first time I saw the film, her situation had kind of escaped me, but I was working on this essay. I did a little research more on her. It talks about, there's a very brief line in the film about how her husband and child had died in the commune, the I think 1848 in Paris. It was really a very violent uprising. And so she was a refugee, totally, from a terrible situation where she'd lost so much. She'd lost her profession as a chef. She'd lost her family. And she is grateful for all the hospitality she receives. And I think, but that's one of the reasons why when conflict begins to surface in that community, she shuts it down because she knows where it can lead. And she, so that really, doing that little bit of research helped me understand the film a lot better. Yeah.
So in Gareth's essay, he emphasizes, which I've found to be a pretty common way of talking about this movie, the sort of the legalism and the failure of that religious community to live up to its own standards, and Babette coming in as a force of grace, providing this sort of unmerited abundance that they had sort of turned their back on.
That's all true. I mean, right. I think it's part of the theme of the film, but I think where people fall down is if they refuse to acknowledge the incredible hospitality this community has offered to someone who is not only from a different nationality, she's a Roman Catholic, which in those days, I mean, even in America in the early 20th century, anti-Catholicism was huge. I mean, so they kind of, they have their little legalistic, pietistic stuff going on with their religion, but as human beings, they kind of reach a different standard.
Yeah, I know that. I found that very helpful in your essay to, because I could never get. I always saw the point that people who write about that movie were making about them being legalistic, and of course that's there, but I could never quite get there in terms of being especially. I couldn't be especially, I guess, judgmental of that community because they seem. They love their squabbles, but they were sweethearts.
Being judgmental is so much fun. We all do it. We love to do it. But I think in this case, it helps. If we judge that little religious community too harshly, we won't see what's really going on.
Yeah.
And that was kind of where Gareth and I it's a nice disagreement. You know?
Right. So I guess what I loved about your framing of it is that you saw it as Babette's generosity as a response to generosity and not a sort of, ex nihilo generosity. And
yes.
And so I love that cycle of hospitality that you describe.
Yeah, because I think hospitality breeds hospitality, it breeds generosity, and that's why it's so important. And of course, as a Benedictine oblate, hospitality is huge. That's a huge Benedictine value to treat. You greet people as they are. You don't hospitality doesn't mean that you're trying to make them more like you. You greet them as they are. And Bette does that. She's appalled by the food these women are eating. And one of the funniest scenes, there are some pretty funny scenes in the movie, but when she adds some herbs and spices to this hideous looking bread soup that the sisters have made for the elderly, there's an old man who's like, he's smelling it. It's like, it's a whole new dish, with her influence. And he's going, oh yeah, this woman's a keeper. I mean, you can just see it in his eyes.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful movie. So you must have seen my notes because my next thing I wanted to ask about, as a Benedictine oblate, you've done a lot of thinking about hospitality, and I imagine you've done some thinking about the relationship between hospitality and creativity, which is very much illustrated in Babette's Feast. That her generosity is the very close connection between generosity and hospitality on the one hand and creativity on the other is very much on display in that movie.
Yes. And I haven't really done much with it. I did do a talk once at a Benedictine Abbey. The abbots had a lecture series with a bunch of women. And my talk was about that the Benedictines had helped me to realize my goal as a writer is to be hospitable to the reader. Mm-hmm. And to invite them in, give them something worthwhile, and then let them leave. And so the whole structure of what I write these days, I keep that in mind. And I had a lot of interesting response to that several of the people there write themselves. There was a prioress from the local nearby monastery said, oh, she'd never seen it that way. Mm-hmm. I said, yeah, hospitality has to enter in because you have to consider the reader or the viewer. And there are filmmakers and writers who deliberately want to alienate people and set them on edge. And that's another form of art. I mean, that's okay too. But for me, I think hospitality is just extremely important.
Kathleen, did you say invite them in and then let them leave? Did you say
invite them in, give them something worthwhile to consider, and then let them leave? So there's a beginning. Well, as Aristotle would say, there's a beginning, middle, and end to any work of art. But for me, it's more okay. I'm inviting someone into something, a new experience, maybe. Give them something to think about, enjoy, whatever, and then find a nice way to just exit and leave them with whatever they want to take from it. Because that's one of the things you definitely learn as a writer, that people will take what you write and do all kinds of things with it. You completely lose control of the work once the reader has it. And that's as it should be. The reader, in a sense, completes the work.
Right. So I'm going to have to do some thinking on that idea of letting them leave. I've thought a good bit about inviting them in, being hospitable, creating a safe space to invite them in and to give them something. But I have not thought much about letting them leave. So I want to do some thinking on that.
Good. And you mentioned Patterson. I'm so glad you like that movie. I think my experience is it's a movie that people either really like a lot or they don't. They just don't get it. It's too slow moving. It's like, why should I care about this guy? It engenders really interesting responses.
Well, I'm inclined not to like movies about writers. I just don't think writing makes for good cinematic experiences. But your point about
he's a bus driver.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
He cares about it. He cares about the people who take his bus. He's somebody he's devoted to his wife. He's devoted to the people who ride his bus, doing a good job for them. Mm-hmm. And then when he gets home from work, he sits and even all during the day, he's writing in a little notebook, these little observations and poems and things. And so he is a poet and he's a bus driver. But so I think you can make a movie about a writer if he's also a bus driver. I think kind of
that's right. Yeah. Well, I loved your observations about the way that routine for him and for monks becomes a scaffolding for a rich and rewarding life. And so it's not a rut for him, but a scaffold. Yeah. And I love that observation. I think that's really helpful, a helpful observation for people who want to do creative work.
And I've learned that, because the times when I have been in residence at St. John's Abbey, there's an apartment complex, about 4 or 5 apartments. You apply to go there and you can work on your projects. It's about a half a mile down the hill from the Abbey. But I found when I got so much more work done when I was going to pray with the monks at 7 a.m., noon, and 5 p.m. was their mass, and 7 p.m. at night. Keeping that kind of structure, especially the morning and noon things, was absolutely amazing to me how much more work I got done because I had that scaffold. That's when I really began to realize how that kind of routine can be a support system for a painter, anyone engaged in creative work, because otherwise, without any structure, you could work all the time, or you could not work at all,
or you could look busy all the time.
Yes.
Well, great. Well, yes, I was so delighted to see that you had written a chapter on him, and there's a sentence in there that I loved. If you have a vocation, you have found your voice.
Yeah.
And I know that vocation is connected to the idea of voice, but I've always thought of it as being a voice outside you has called you to something. And I love that idea that when you have a vocation also, and I think that is true, right? That there's something outside you that calls you to a vocation. But it never occurred to me that to have a vocation is to also have your own voice.
Find your voice, find what it is you're meant to do. But that really was etymology. I looked up the word of vocation, and it is related to the word for voice. And so that's really what gave me that insight that because there are other people who want to influence you to be whatever they think you should be. But when you find your vocation, it's your inner voice that you're validating what you've heard inside.
So, I loved the fact that you didn't go straight to, so Patterson found his vocation as a poet. Patterson's vocation was as a bus driver.
Absolutely.
And it was also connected to the poetry. It was all one calling, perhaps.
And it's true. I've known, I used to, when I worked in New York City for the Academy of American Poets at my first post-college job, it was so fascinating to see there were poets who worked completely outside of academia. Many of them were teaching, writing, and all that kind of stuff. But Mae Swenson worked as a secretary on Wall Street. And when she won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, a lot of her co-workers hadn't even known she wrote poetry. Of course, Wallace Stevens famously, and Ted Kooser, too, from Nebraska, worked for insurance companies. That I was always interested to see people who certainly had a vocation as poets, but they decided not to teach it, not to go into the academic world, but live outside that world and find another kind of vocation. I always thought that was a that was very interesting. And Patterson kind of reminded me of some of those people.
Yeah. Well, Kathleen Norris, I know you've got a lot going on this week since this is release week, so I'm going to let you go. But thank you so much for being here. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm so excited about your book, and I love the insights that it provides, and hope a lot of people read and benefit from it.
Well, thank you. And one film I want to mention, because it's not well known, it is available for streaming, is Corey-Ada's film Afterlife. I mean to say about that movie, I envy anybody watching it for the first time. And I just had an experience with actually one of the people who produces films for Terrence Malick, who had never seen it before and was just absolutely floored by it. It's a beautiful, gentle little film. So that's another lesser known film in the book that I really care about. That was my choice.
Great.
I said, we have to.
It's chapter 11, I see. And that's available on streaming?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for that recommendation. And thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much.
All right. Bye.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.